Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in a series that NCME is putting on diversity, equity, and inclusion and assessment. This point, we're going to focus on admission and selection assessments. Your facilitators today are yours truly, Marianne Perie of WestEd, and Kyndra. You want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kyndra Middleton, Professor of Educational Psychology at Howard University.
Thank you. And I'm going to take a brief moment to introduce our panel today. We have folks from 3 different organizations who are going to lead us through this discussion. First off, let's start with Diane Henderson of ACT. Diane, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hold it. Yes, I do. I'm double muted. How's that for fun? Good afternoon, everyone. Diane Henderson, Vice President of Research and Psychometrics at ACT, and glad to be with you all. Some of you know me from various other roles across multiple places at ETS, Professional Exam Services, or Renaissance. So very glad to be here to talk about this important topic.
Thank you. And next we have Kadriye Ercikan from ETS.
Hi, everyone. Good to see so many colleagues joining this session, and thanks to NCME for organizing this. Really excited to be part of this discussion. I lead Research and Measurement Sciences at ETS.
Terrific. And David Klieger, also from ETS.
Hi, I'm David Klieger. I'm a senior research scientist at ETS, and I support many of our higher educational testing programs, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And then from the Association of American Medical Colleges, we have Cindy Searcy and Mark Krupnick. Cindy?
Hi, I'm Cindy Searcy. I am the Senior Director of MCAT Research and Development. I oversee the development, psychometrics, and validation research, and I think I have more than 2 decades of work in the assessment field in the context of health professions in licensure and admissions. So it's really an honor to be here. Excited to tell you all what we're doing and also learn from others about things we could do better. So thank you.
And
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Krupnick. I am the Director of MCAT Development and Psychometrics. And I've been working on this exam for just about a decade and a half, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, everyone. And so we're going to go through these presentations in the same order folks introduce themselves. We thought we would start with undergraduate admissions, graduate school admissions, and then professional school admissions, and talk about the different issues that are raised by each type of admission and selection assessment in terms of the diversity and equity and inclusion lens. Just a reminder that these sessions are being recorded. We ask as you have questions or thoughts that you place them into the chat, and hopefully within about 5 business days after the webinar, after today, we'll be posting the actual video of this. We also, NCME has a YouTube channel as well, so you can look for these videos there. And we will also post the slideshow, the slide deck, because several of these presenters have also included references that you may want access to. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Diane.
Thank you, Marianne. As I said, welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here and talk about college admissions assessments. I've been through a number of different types of assessments and been working here for the last 3 years, which has probably been the most challenging 3 years for college admissions that has in its history. So next slide, please. We know that post-secondary education matters. Slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, post-secondary education matters, and we know this because, we know that a lot of what we try to look as the indicator, not just admissions, but completion, and we know it's one of the best ways of what we would call social economic mobility through education, myself included. was the one way that I would get out of spending my life on a farm in the middle of nowhere in Canada. So education does matter. We do know that the attainment remains unequal across racial and ethnic groups. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we've heard some of the people before us talk about this. And I'll address a little bit more of it as we go along. Next slide. A little history. All of you are probably familiar with the ACT. I actually grew up or spent time in the US. ACT was totally unfamiliar for me. As a Canadian, we did not take college admissions tests per se. 60 years ago or so, Lindquist founded the organization to help democratize the access to higher education, to provide an option to the SAT. And one of the founders, the belief was that if we tied this more closely to what students were learning in school, they would have a better opportunity to achieve and get higher scores. They wanted because they wanted to broaden access to college and for the underrepresented groups. As a presenter last year observed, assessments haven't changed much in over a century, and in fact, the ACT has not changed significantly in its design since its initiation. There's been some small changes. We've updated modernized our methods, but for the most part, it's the same exam. In addition, we also know that the statistical and psychometric methods haven't changed much either. My PhD was based on DISC, so that's probably the extent, and it doesn't, besides some variations of DISC and some new emerging things that we're looking at, we really don't think about equity and fairness much more beyond that, and it's sort of the typical validity evidence. And over the last couple of years, we've been challenged to rethink that. And I want to share with you some of the things that we're doing and how we're rethinking about those things. Next slide. We have a lot of evidence over the years in the mean score differences, not surprising. We know what the mean score differences are across different test scores, across different subgroups. We follow and track that through the pandemic. We also have a lot of understanding of what graduation rates are. We understand and track these students from graduation through enrollment to completion. And we learned some really interesting things there. We also have done a lot of studies on access to technology and connectivity, access to rigorous course taking, so those schools that might have access to AP courses or college credit courses. And we know that in all cases, we see significant differences. And I was reminded and humbled by the presentation last week from the quotation from Helms, where just because we're seeing differences between racial groups, that is potentially unfair if there's not considerable evidence that to exist, that it is actually valid and non-biased. And I know we've spent a lot of time doing a lot of analysis and a lot of traditional psychometrics. And we have a lot of evidence that we're trying to support students in different ones. But as an indicator, and as in the case of just like AYP, federal and state accountability programs, it does help shine a light onto the inequities which we see in the educational system, which, as previous presenters have said, have helped to perpetuate and is evidence of systemic racism, which is sobering. Next slide. Next two slides, actually. So college admissions is actually not a level playing field from the very get-go. Without the test scores, there are many other things that are looked at. Sometimes we think about it as a holistic perspective, but college admissions officers are looking at a variety of indicators or information that students provide to them. Most of these, as you can look across, are not really standardized. They are going to vary by individual and as well as their background and access. So simply eliminating a college admissions test won't address the foundational issue. And in all cases, and there's lots of work and research to show this, it's not a level playing field on all of these indicators. So simply just eliminating the college admissions test will not make a meaningful change. So basically, we have a lot of investment for parents that have money can really influence and change a lot and give people an advantage over people that may not have access to those kinds of things. Next slide. Interestingly, though, most colleges do admit the majority of applicants. So on average, 2/3 of first-time freshmen or applicants are offered admission to a four-year school. Over 80% of places accepted 50% or more applicants. And so in short, most colleges, counselors are looking for a reason to admit students. Unfortunately, students aren't always paired with the colleges that they're looking to admit. There is, on the other side, some very highly selective colleges that have very high, very low acceptance rates. So for example, Stanford and Harvard admitted only 5% of the applicants who sought entry in 2020. We get a lot. Next slide. One of the interesting studies that has happened, and this we did in collaboration with some folks that were looking at income segregation at selective colleges. So they actually take the data from the ACT and the SAT and matched it with income records. And that their hypothesis when they looked at this, if they simply equalized attendance rates across parental income groups, conditional on test scores, we would reduce the underrepresentation of low-income students at selective schools by 38%. That's pretty significant. Right now, 7.3 of low-income students currently attend Ivy Plus schools. Attendance rates for these students would need to rise to 25.8%. This is roughly the advantage that legacy students have, as well as other preferred groups in the admission process. That is pretty staggering. Next slide. ACT today. We do take a look, and we're constantly looking at opportunities to do this kind of work, to understand what are the gaps and how can we help. A lot of people don't know or are familiar with ACT's commitment to equity. We have a specific Center for Equity and Learning that's committed to showcasing and supporting our efforts to close the opportunity and outcome gaps for individuals and first-generation students, students of colors, and families with economic challenges. Lots of people don't know that we've been introduced fee waivers for students since 1980. Most of these are from low income or traditionally underrepresented students. And actually 20% of all registrations are completed with a fee waiver. In addition, we have extensive partnerships across a multitude of different relationships to support students to prepare for post-secondary high school success. And we do a lot of joint research with them. One of the interesting things, the research that just came out today, is we found that it makes a lot of sense, college preparation, the amount that you do in high school leads to more success in college. And we know that with the pandemic, a lot of that was interrupted, and not surprising, it was not universally interrupted across all of the groups of students. Mostly students with low income and different backgrounds had more interruptions than others. Next slide. This particular slide, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it does show some of our past and present collaborations that we are working actively to sort of make a difference in the college admission space to allow and hopefully get more students from a variety of backgrounds into college. Next slide. Our ultimate goal is the intentional, thoughtful, and culturally affirming, rigorous, and transformational assessments that support learners on their pathway to success. We've introduced this year interdisciplinary comprehensive diversity, equity, inclusion research agenda that we've cataloged all of our research that's been conducted by ACT and our partners in the past and made efforts to identify new research that needs to be done and link that into actionable insights that we can do to make things a lot more fair. We have a DEI community of practice. We have a monthly meeting. It's very active. It's a very safe space for people to understand and learn and share ideas and educate ourselves. which is making a difference. And you'll see that in the next couple of slides as we look at the diversity of things that people are looking at as trying to find solutions. Every employee at the company has at least one DEI focus goal. We believe that that's really important. We're asked to say, what are the practical things that you're doing? This is super practical. So every employee, every team member has one. We also have embarked on a company-wide set of seminars. The most recent one was Trabian Shorters, who talked about asset framing, which simply means describing others from the perspective of their accomplishments and strengths. And I am sobered by that because I've spent my entire career, mostly with No Child Left Behind starting, talking about gaps. And the risk there is when we do talk about the deficit framing, it doesn't always translate into what we want to happen. So if we think about the gaps, we need to be able to communicate these in ways that showcase and underscore the inequities in the system and not attributes of a particular group. Next page, the next slide. Our current projects, again, we think about equality and equity, and I'm going to go pretty quickly over the next one. And I think a presenter last week talked about why don't we think about these kinds of issues in the same way we do with accommodation. So next slide, we have really found that in leveling the playing field, it makes a difference with ELLs and students with disabilities. And the more accommodations and supports we provide these students, the more effective they are at scoring in the test, the more successful they are, rather. So we're looking about that and how do we address that in terms of academic achievement overall? We know that investment matters. Next slide. We are actively working right now with Gear Up, which is empowering low-income students to become prepared for post-high school success. We have an active social-emotional learning curricula and assessment program, and we're examining how that makes a difference. And we see that students that start below their peers in the academic disciplines and commitments and academic success indicators in 7th grade, as a result of in this program, have higher scores in all 3 by grade 12. Students that score in the bottom 25% of the academic success index show higher growth from grade 7 through 12 than their peers in other quartiles. So investment does matter. Next slide. From a content development perspective, we've always done everything that everybody else has done. We have rigorous reviews, fairness and bias. We have diverse groups. We look for diverse representation of authors with our passages and trying to get a lot of diversity there. But we know it's not enough. So currently we're taking a lot of time and investment into exploring strategies to enhance and deepen the ways that our reading passages reflect and affirm. We are engaging with equity experts and education experts to better calibrate our reading passages and selections. We're incorporating passages that recognize the complex mix of experiences students navigate and creating affirming experiences for all students taking the reading test. We're also collaborating with education nationwide to provide a window into our student population so we can create materials that they see themselves represented in and are relevant to them. Next slide. Additional projects that we're working on, we're looking at pipeline gaps for low-income first-generation students of color and high-demand careers. We're exploring whether the process for developing SEL items, actually right from the ground up, can we make them yet even more culturally relevant and sensitive? We're looking for opportunities to help students to decide which college to attend, which major to choose, and helping them get financial aid, talking to counselors about choice, and that sort of thing. We're also learning about the experience and perception of EL students using support, and we're researching counselor responsive assessment items through cognitive labs, interviews and surveys, and randomly equivalent groups taking different versions of items. Next slide. In terms of what can we do to improve the success rate of students that are applying for colleges, one of the things that we're actively lobbying is to consider social emotional skills. We know that social emotional learning skills are predictive of college success, above and beyond all the traditional academic factors, while exhibiting small to no group differences. So we're helping people to see that this is something that they should be incorporating into their admissions considerations. We're also developing integrated solutions to support all student journeys to provide more opportunities to all students. It's currently in flight, including exploring potential majors and careers and the best fit of students. Most importantly, we know that all the supports are not the same, so it was truly be customized. And we also know that approximately 40% of students don't go the traditional route. So we're thinking also about how do we include that 40% of students so that they can advance into meaningful careers and have well-paying and rewarding careers. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. So next up, I believe Kadriya is going to start us off here, talking about what's happening at ETS.
Great. Thanks, Marianne. Let's move on to the next slide. First of all, I just want to thank NCME and my organizing colleagues for yet another set of really important seminars on key topics in our field. It's a critically important time for us to examine diversity, equity, and inclusion in assessments, as well as the role of assessment in promoting and possibly impeding on equity in admissions and broader societal diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Diane highlighted, and it was also brought up in the last week's webinar, how fixed the concepts of measurement and fairness notions have stayed for several decades now. And we do believe that it is a critically important time for us to rethink some of these concepts and build on what we have developed over the several decades as the field of measurement, but rethink all aspects of assessment and measurement. What I will do is I will start off with describing a sort of research projects and research agenda around equity, fairness at ETS. We as researchers at ETS recognize the importance of reevaluating assessment, measurement, and the role of assessment plays in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in this first part of the presentation, I'll discuss the intensive research at ETS on these topics, and then turn it over to David, who will describe diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education admissions with a focus on GRE and graduate admissions. Next. I want to start off with emphasizing that promotion of equity in admissions and life opportunity starts off from equity in opportunities in learning, opportunities in learning in K through 12. Even though the admissions decision-making processes, the assessments used in these decision-making need to be scrutinized, just focusing on admissions processes is unlikely to make a difference in equity in societal opportunities. To address inequities in opportunity for higher education or graduate education and life opportunities, we need to focus on opportunity to learn, assessments used in the admissions, the assessment decisions processes themselves, and an opportunity and support for individuals to succeed, to be successful in these higher education programs once they're admitted. Next. This research agenda I'm going to be talking about is aligned with this vision of equity. We have organized a research program around three themes: socioculturally responsive teaching and learning, socioculturally responsive assessment, and equity and fairness in assessment more broadly, and equity and fairness issues in admissions to higher education institutions. The first two areas of this research, socioculturally responsive teaching learning and socioculturally responsive assessment, are central to and foundation for improving the quality of and expanding opportunities for teaching and learning in both K through 12 and higher education for all students, and for creating pathways for equity in and success in higher education. The focus of the third research strand on admissions, and in particular holistic admissions, is central to equity in educational and societal opportunity. These connected lines of research are critical for addressing current educational and societal challenges and for driving equity focus in learning, assessment, and opportunity in higher education. Given the focus of this seminar and limited time I have, I'll focus on describing research on socioculturally responsive assessment and higher education admissions. Next. There is a great need for assessments to be better aligned with student learning, culture, and life experiences. This research program aims to develop the scientific basis for ETS and the measurement field more broadly to build assessments that are grounded in learners' cultural context, sociocultural context. Some proposed strategies for addressing structural stigma, societal and educational inequities include non-standardized assessments, multi-occasion testing, or use of student engagement data from learning environments. This research will develop methodologies to examine those strategies. In conjunction with this research is our methodological research on how to define equity and fairness in our critical context, how to use technological advances that promote equity and fairness, and development of methodologies to facilitate examining such equity and fairness. Next. The principles for socioculturally responsive assessment we're developing are based on multiple relevant literatures, including anti-racist pedagogy, socioculturally responsive classroom assessment, assessment of English learners, the learning sciences, and educational measurement. Among the many promising ideas those literature suggests is designing assessments so that they adapt not only to an individual's knowledge level, but also to their ways of knowing, practices, interests, and cultural identity. The research will mark a departure from the traditional standardization framework in which all test takers receive the same tasks, which are given under the same conditions and scored using the same models. It will involve building on conditional inference and fairness notions discussed by Ms. Levy in his 2018 book to rethink approaches to assessment design, measurement modeling, and interpretation. Through this research, we plan to expand on our current notions of fairness and develop measurement methodologies that facilitate taking sociocultural context into account in all aspects of assessments. In addition, we're working on methodologies for evaluating equity and fairness issues in artificial intelligence-based methodologies, such as those used for scoring and an item generation. A key outcome of this research program will be a research basis for socioculturally responsive assessment that can be used in developing and revising assessments. We expect this research to inform all assessment development efforts at ETS and hopefully more broadly. Next. The third research strand is focusing on holistic admissions in higher education. As we know, growing number of colleges and universities are changing their admissions criteria and practices at both the undergraduate and graduate levels to place heavier emphasis on evaluating a broader set of skills and methods of measuring performance than focusing on conventional standardized assessments. the general term for this practice is holistic review. Even though there is a lot of coverage of holistic review, there is very limited research documenting how holistic reviews are actually conducted across programs and departments and schools, and the outcomes in terms of both diversity and academic rigor of admitted student cohorts. Our research in this area aims to shed light on the current practices of holistic review and their outcomes, understanding student perspectives on holistic admissions and how changes in admissions requirements impact on students' application decisions, particularly for students from underserved backgrounds. Goals for this research are better understanding of holistic admissions with and without test scores, and whether this approach to admissions without test scores meets the goals of advancing equity and exploring tools and strategies that can help with equity and diversity. Next, this strand of research on holistic admissions has 4 related projects. The first one focuses on the holistic admission practices through publicly available data. This project examines what best practices for holistic review have been identified and what additional practices could be considered to improve the process, focusing on various models of holistic review and how the practices that define them vary across disciplines, institutional types, and so on. The second set of projects focus on admissions officers, surveys, and interviews. This research will seek to identify the challenges that admissions committees typically experience when engaging in holistic review. The third is student surveys. The goal of this part is to explore students' perspectives and perceptions around holistic admissions approaches with or without test optional policies. And we'll also examine the outcomes of holistic reviews. Drawing on the existing data, we'll examine what indicators define whether holistic admission strategies have been successful and how these outcomes might differ between institutions which are requiring test scores versus those that are not. Through this research, we aim to gain better understanding of challenges and promises in holistic admissions. In particular, we'll examine to what extent holistic admissions meet intended equity goals and their unintended consequences, positive or negative, and provide guidance on strategies for advancing equity in admissions. Before I turn it over to David, I want to highlight that we are not doing this research on our own, and actually in the process of engaging external expert consultants to help us with this, as well as partnering with different organizations in the K-12 space with different education institutions, and focusing on admissions, partnering with a variety of higher education institutions. With that, I turn it over to David.
Well, thank you very much, Kadriya. So now I'm going to pivot us a bit so that we can focus more specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion in graduate and professional school admissions. So we're going to touch upon fairness and equity in admissions. That will include fairness and equity in assessments. Now, assessments are not the entirety of admissions, but of course they are a major component. Also, I'll touch quickly upon how ETS strongly supports the use of holistic admissions. ETS very strongly encourages the field to focus additional research efforts on better understanding holistic admissions. I'll also briefly talk about the use of the GRE in advancing diversity in broad holistic admissions contexts. Also, broadening the network of measurable skills to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very important goal of ETS, and that type of research should certainly be promoted. And then finally, I'll touch upon the importance of providing additional learning opportunities, how that is a critical area for additional research and some of the work that ETS is doing in that area. If you can please move to the next slide. Thank you. So ETS continues to strongly advocate the use of holistic admissions and is poised to deliver additional tools to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that involves a great deal of research. And we certainly encourage the field of measurement to similarly look at this area. Best practices in holistic admissions are described by ETS experts at this URL. And we are developing additional opportunities for candidates to demonstrate their strengths through additional admissions tools. So we believe strongly in holistic admissions, and we are facilitating holistic admissions through the development of these particular tools, like PSQ, a soft skills tool, the JD Next exam, which is a preparation exam for law school, and Kira talent interviews. And I'll touch upon those examples in future slides. And ETS experts are available to provide guidance to those who are interested in how they can best promote holistic admissions in their particular programs and institutions. So one way ETS is trying to advance diversity through holistic admissions is by trying to expand the use of assessments into new contexts in which these assessments can contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as validity. Here is a relatively recent example where the GRE on a wide basis was introduced into the law school space for use in law school admissions. And by introducing the GRE into this space, among other things, we were able to widen the law school pipeline to well-qualified minority applicants, as well as to those with STEM backgrounds. The GRE is taken by many individuals who have STEM backgrounds who do not take the other leading admissions assessment for law school. And in addition, ETS through the GRE is testing larger pools of candidates who come from a diverse set of backgrounds, and that widens the pool and provides greater access to a diverse group of candidates. If you can move to the next slide. ETS also strongly believes in measuring new skills to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, ETS believes in broadening the network of skills that can be considered in the admissions process to include criterion relevant and diversity enhancing non-cognitive or soft skills. In particular, ETS is working on a tool called PSQ, and it assesses these 14 listed sets of soft skills that research indicates are important to both academic and workplace success. So achievement, organization, responsibility, you can see the skills listed here. And certainly ETS encourages the measurement field to also pursue this type of evaluation and to strongly research it so that we better understand how these types of skills can best be measured and how they can best contribute to the admissions process. If you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. So here's proof of concept of how a soft skills measure can contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this uses as an example a measure from the PPI, the Personal Potential Index. That was an assessment that's no longer operational at ETS. We did conduct a great deal of validity and diversity research for the PPI. And here we see on the left side of the screen a bar that represents the entire applicant pool, specifically the percentage of the applicant pool that comes from various historically underrepresented groups, Black and African American males, Black and African American females, Hispanic males, and Hispanic females. And then on the right side, you see 5 bars, which indicate what happens to the minority historically underrepresented representation as you move from a system on the left that's 100% based on undergraduate GPA and standardized test scores towards a system that increasingly includes soft skills assessment. And you can see the bars are clearly increasing in height as you move from left to right. And through empirical evidence, we can demonstrate that the inclusion of soft skills measures into the admissions process that includes other measures, a holistic process, can in fact improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this graph appears in a paper that was just published in the International Journal of Testing. If you could move to the next slide. It's also critically important for the field to address learning opportunities, to expand learning opportunities. And one way that can be done is through socio-emotional learning assessment. It's important for higher educational assessment to move beyond just admissions. Why not use assessment to benefit everyone who takes the assessment? And I like this notion that assessment for learning and development can be a rising tide that lifts all boats. Research shows that soft skills are critical to both academic and vocational success, yet students often have received little to no education or training on these types of skills. And generally there's been very limited prior selection on those skills, at least in any formal or significant sense. Also, assessment should include socio-emotional learning or socio-emotional learning assessment so that all students are prepared for the rigors of both post-secondary education and the workforce. If you could move to the next slide, please. And not only can we increase our commitment to learning, but we can commit to that endeavor in a way to prepare all students before they even start school. So a lot of interventions, a lot of learning interventions begin after the student has already started their education, when they've already potentially fallen behind. But we can actually prepare students before they even start school. And JD Next is one example of how we can do that. It's essentially a preparatory opportunity for aspirants to law school so that they can not only see what law school will be like so they can decide whether or not they want to attend law school, but it's also a way to develop those critical skills that are necessary for success once they're in law school. So this way, they don't fall behind before they even start law school. And this is a way to prepare all students, including members of traditionally underrepresented groups. If you can move to the end, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kadriya and David. I appreciate that. And now we're going to move on to talk about the MCAT. Mark, are you starting?
I am. Thank you very much. Cindy and I are very pleased to be here today to talk with you about diversity, equity, inclusion, the MCAT exam, and medical school admissions. Next slide, please. We will first introduce the exam for those of you that might be unfamiliar. We'll talk about the DE&I influences in test design and development, test preparation and outreach, the use of scores in admissions, and then we'll zoom out a bit and talk about the AAMC's mission and strategic plan. So the MCAT exam is used in medical school admissions in the US and Canada. It tests concepts from the natural, behavioral, and social sciences, as well as problem-solving skills that students typically learn in college. It also has a test section that assesses verbal reasoning skills. The test includes a mix of passage-based and standalone multiple-choice questions. It's delivered on the computer. It's a linear exam. And overall, it's designed to assess applicants' academic readiness for medical school. Next slide, please. The exam is 4 test sections, and they are test sections that have a lot of words in them. So I'm not going to read them all to you right now. Give you a second to take a look, and then we'll move on. Next slide, please. So the current version of the exam launched in 2015, and it was a result of a multi-year effort that sought input from multiple stakeholders. The exam was designed by and for medical schools. Specifically, there was a committee of stakeholders that led the design, and they consulted panels of experts. They held many outreach events and conducted extensive surveys. Those surveys included the oversampling of HBCUs and minority serving institutions, in part to ensure that the topics that were tested on the MCAT exam were widely taught. The members of this committee varied in their roles and their backgrounds and experiences, and they were well positioned to represent applicants from different backgrounds and different educational opportunities, so that those experiences were reflected on the exam that they developed. The exam allows for multiple opportunities for examinees to show their strengths. There are 2 natural sciences sections, 1 social and behavioral science section, and a verbal reasoning section. The verbal reasoning section draws from passages from the social sciences and humanities, and specifically includes passages that address population health and diverse cultures. Unlike the first 3 sections, the verbal reasoning section, like many other reading comprehension and reasoning tests, do not require any specific knowledge be brought to the exam, but rather just being well read would position one for success. Next slide, please. Okay. Our work is not done. I'm sorry, that's the next slide. We continue to design the exam so that there was more working time per test question relative to the previous exam. There is a 15-point scale that is centered at 125 for each section, and 500 is the center for the total score when we add up all 4 sections. Our initial outreach encouraged medical schools to consider applicants with scores in the middle of the scale. Using history as a guide, we expected that those with scores in the middle of the scale would come from a variety of different backgrounds, experiences, and opportunities, and that they would be successful in medical school. Our data since the launch has confirmed this. Our score report provides much more than just a score. There's confidence bands with instructions on how to interpret a confidence band. There are score profiles to be able to visually appreciate one's strengths and weaknesses, and there are percentile ranks. Next slide, please. We continue to monitor our exam and are involved in current initiatives to improve the exam and our outreach. Currently, we're evaluating items that flag for diff to identify potential learning gaps. And we hope to leverage this learning to future opportunities for test preparation and outreach. We're keeping current by retiring reading passages that examinees would be unlikely to encounter in everyday reading or in college. And we continue to recruit for a diverse set of item writers and reviewers. Now I will hand over the presentation to Cindy.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. I'm first going to talk about our preparation resources, and then I'm going to talk about score use and admissions. So let's start with test prep. There's a lot that goes well in doing a comprehensive test like the MCAT exam. It covers multiple subjects taken across multiple courses and years in college, and many students have never had to get ready for this kind of exam. Students without mentors, advisors, or strong networks need scaffolding to strategically prepare. And preparing well for the MCAT exam is really ultimately about learning the science and reasoning skills that the building blocks for learning in medical school. So we offer a menu of free and low-cost resources, from getting started to studying and practices to getting ready for test day. So, and really as a set, they're designed so that students can prepare for the exam without an expensive commercial test prep course. I want to highlight our MCAT collection in the Khan Academy. We created this collection of free video tutorials with questions so that all students could study MCAT concepts and skills And we did this with a partnership with the Khan Academy and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And since it was launched, it's very heavily used, and it's one of our most highly valued resources. As another example, Mark talked about the critical analysis and reasoning section, and you might not be surprised that some students find it hard to prepare for this kind of test. They can't study content, they just have to learn how to demonstrate their reasoning skills. They're advised to read a variety of topics from different types of literature to practice those reasoning skills, and that can feel kind of opaque. So we have some resources that we've been building over time that give a better understanding of what those reasoning skills mean, how to see what's being asked in the test questions, and look for content in the passages to be able to demystify what it's like to really get ready for this test. And then that includes some walkthrough videos with someone explaining how this all works. Next slide. We also, in thinking about our prep materials, strive for equitable access to all. But our research shows that some students from marginalized and lower SES backgrounds, they use these resources at lower rates. And common barriers are not surprising. They include cost, competing time demands, and specifically job and family obligations, reliable internet access, and general awareness that these resources even exist. So I'm going to walk through some of the ways that we address these barriers. And I'm going to start with cost. MCAT prep resources are free or low cost, and students who qualify for the AAMC's fee assistance program get them for free. The AAMC also recently lowered the eligibility requirements for this fee assistance program to expand the number of individuals who qualify. We also think about accessibility broadly, meaning the ability to use all of these resources together in this like purpose-driven way. And it can be daunting to figure out how to put preparation materials into a tailored study plan. So we worked with a learning specialist on a step-by-step study plan guide that students can tailor to their need. It's integrated with our web-based platform of resources so that students can seamlessly move in between their tailored study plan and easily access the resources. And that might be helpful, especially for students who have limited time demands or like the struggle with the wherewithal to figure out how to put these things together. And we now have an MCAT YouTube channel with an instructional playlist to go along with this. And I'm getting old. And now what we're doing is we're investigating back to offline access, because internet access can be a barrier to some to using these mostly web-based resources. Next slide, please. Awareness is necessary to be able to use these resources. It's about equitable access. And our research shows this may be an issue for some examinees. And to this end, we lead ongoing MCAT outreach campaigns. We have a targeted focus on students from underrepresented, marginalized, and non-traditional or other disadvantaged backgrounds. We use a variety of communications and events types and messaging campaigns to extend our research. And really our focus is on meeting students where they are. And for example, just before the pandemic and then really honing our skills during the pandemic, we have virtual recruiting fairs that reach thousands more students than our in-person events could ever think of doing. And it gives these students access to virtually all of our medical schools, as well as advising organizations and other student organizations and AAMC staff. So our ability to reach students and for them to ask questions of more kinds of people is really magnified with this virtual world we're now in. And the last thing I want to talk about is inclusiveness. Inclusiveness of our resources, highlighting stories of individuals from different backgrounds who've successfully prepared for and taken the MCAT exam. It's an important signal to future aspiring physicians. Our preparation resources include testimonials of students with a wide variety of backgrounds who provide tactics and lessons learned from their experiences. But pre-medical students want to talk to humans, real people. So we're experimenting with a pilot webinar series. We don't know where it'll go, where current medical students who are interested in serving, giving back to upcoming students from different backgrounds can share their stories about how they prepared for the exam and really ultimately for medical school, and do live Q&A that we can record in a form and make available to other students. And in addition to talking about how they prepare for the exam, these students can more authentically than us as test developers help pre-medical students make the connection that getting ready for the MCAT is really about learning for medical school. Next slide. So now I'm switching topics to describe how we address DE&I in our score use. And really, for more than a decade, the AAMC has provided scholarship, education tools, and resources to help our medical schools employ mission-focused admissions practices that consider applicants holistically with balanced weights given to experiences, non-academic, and academic competencies that are all needed to be ready for medical school. And so in this context, as developers of the MCAT exam, we frame all of our resources, data, and information in this broader context of holistic review. Next slide. We have a flagship publication, the Guide to Using MCAT Data in Medical Student Selection. It does things it should do, like illustrate how to use confidence bands. It shows data on score differences by group to put scores in context. It treats balanced consideration of experiences, non-academic and academic metrics, and it weaves together our data with important points to help medical schools think about their own holistic review. So it shows with national data that acceptance decisions that schools make are based on more than just MCATs and GPAs. And it highlights national data that shows that students admitted with a wide range of MCAT scores and GPAs succeed. We have a new set of integrated reports for medical schools. They're dynamic, configurable by the schools with their own local data to allow them to self-serve. It allows them to easily track their progress in things like recruiting, accepting, and matriculating applicants with backgrounds and experiences that are important to their mission and have been historically underrepresented in medicine. So they can study their own outcomes, because medical schools, many don't have a data person in-house that can do this kind of on-demand reports for them. And then finally, the AAMC recently announced the launch of a new assessment, the AAMC Preview Professional Readiness Exam, which is really an assessment of non-academic competencies that are important for entering students to have. It's another assessment we have that's designed by and for medical schools. It provides more reliable information about these non-academic competencies, like teamwork, cultural sensitivity, resilience. It helps fill out the picture of all the competencies incoming students need and further supports the employment of holistic review. Next slide. Our validity research is led by the AAMC MCAT Validity Committee, which includes representatives from 17 schools in the US and Canada and leaders in pre-medical health professions advising. Their research agenda covers questions about fairness, test use, and predictive validity, but really through their lens. And they address questions that will contribute to the diversification of the future physician workforce. And the references that Marianne talked about that'll be available later include their publications. And I just want to highlight one so you can see how they think about using the data that they study to promote and advocate for change. So there's a perspective that shows that medical schools that accept more students with mid-range MCAT scores have more diverse classes. So widening the lens results in more diverse classes. And they also show that students with these mid-range scores have success rates in school that are nearly the same as those with scores that are higher. And so they make the argument that widening your view is one important way to diversify medical schools. We also did a recent survey of medical schools on their efforts to diversify their entering classes. And this survey asks these basic questions like, what are schools trying to accomplish? What gets in the way? How are they doing it? And where are there opportunities for improvement? And this slide shows some of the key findings, and there are data snapshots on our website. I encourage you to go there. But the bottom line is that medical schools believe that admissions is important, but it's not enough. Schools must invest in and build a community of support for students to drive this inclusive excellence. So this leads me to some concluding remarks. So Mark described DE&I in the context of test design and development, and I talked about test prep and score use. And as the MCAT developers, these are the areas where we have the most impact and the greatest influence. But when it comes to broader systems and structures, that's where we turn to our broader organization and its reach. So the AAMC's mission is to lead and serve the academic community to improve the health of people everywhere. Ample research shows that diversity is a core driver of high quality healthcare. And yet the current makeup of the physician workforce and of current medical students is much less diverse than the nation it serves. And this is a long-standing reality. The AAMC strategic plan aims for a healthier future for all, and diversification of the physician workforce is central, and it will require all of us to lean in. So Mark and I thank you for your time, and we invite you to check out our website and these resources. And now I'll turn it back to Marianne and Kyndra. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy and Mark. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Kyndra to lead us through a discussion with some of these questions, and I will keep an eye on the chat. So if you have questions about any part of this topic, about admissions in general, or for any presenters, please place them in the chat.
All right, thank you, panelists. That was great. And I'm looking forward to this discussion that we're about to have. So the first question, I'm just going to ask the first question that's on this slide. What would you say is the most important problem you are trying to solve? I know each of you mentioned several different things, but if you had to pick one important problem, what would it be?
I'm happy to go, Kyndra, if
Sure.
you would like me to.
Yes.
I mean, the thing is, the most important problem we're trying to solve related to today's topic is advancing equity in admissions. And the research agenda and the activities David described are all intended to support equity in admissions. And the most effective way for graduate admissions and undergraduate admissions to be more equitable is for higher education institutions is to make this a priority through effective holistic admissions processes, through emphasizing diversity in criteria used in admissions, importance of personal qualities that are important not just for graduate school, but general success in careers and life in general, and through advancing opportunities before individuals get to the point of applying for undergraduate, graduate, or professional programs. So I would say that the most important problem we're trying to solve that's relevant to today's topic is really advancing equity in admissions. The connected areas of research are all intended to support that, that goal.
Thank you. And anyone else, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, so this is such a toughie, but when I think about the context that Mark and I work in, really, I think the most important problem is that when we're talking, we talk about admissions as though it's one thing, but it's not, it's local, right? So any solution to effectively diversifying medical classes is about tailoring the use of all of this information to each school's local context, their mission, their support, and what they're trying to accomplish. And with that ecosystem, like, I think the most important thing, our greatest opportunity, is to figure out how to leverage our data in a way that fits in, that understands their problem they're trying to solve, and gives them the right data in the right way so that they can make use of it in accomplishing their goals. And that's what that I think is the biggest problem we're trying to solve. And then to take those lessons learned and figure out how to scale them, because ultimately what we want is tools and resources to serve all schools with enough flexibility so that they can adapt them to their own local priorities and contexts.
All right, thank you. Anyone else?
Sure, I'll just round it out and say, I think like everybody else, our most important problem that we're trying to solve is how do we fundamentally change the pipeline, if we could use that word, of how do we get all students prepared for meaningful careers, whether that be through college or through a non-college route, so that they can have meaningful work and most importantly, an income that can sustain themselves and upward mobility. It's a very complex problem that we're trying to solve, and we're trying to do it in multiple approaches. Certainly looking at college admissions, the criteria, we can see that every one of those things has some inherent inequity attached to it. So if we can help get access or support to the students earlier, how do we get them more mentorship? How do we get them to understand what their options are? How do we help them make good decisions about what classes should I be taking? How do I think about what my interests are, and how do they align to a potential track of either technical college, four-year college, or right into work? Giving them those tools to help make them the decisions, and then support where they may need to have a remediation or some additional training or some encouragement or whatever it is that needs to be. It's kind of a complex issue. And that's what we're trying to solve. I mean, the assessment aside, important to try to figure out how do we do that better, but the real important part is how do we actually get people prepared? And it starts really early.
All right, thank you. So I think that may hit a little at equity. So I'm gonna not ask question 2, but kind of something related to it based on the chat. So how do multiple measures increase equity and inclusion? Because I think we've heard about diversity, but what about the equity and inclusion piece?
Well, I'll take that. Try. I mean, equity and inclusion is definitely more than just diversity. It's really about how do we make things more fair for people in a system that is kind of set up for folks not to be successful. And that's where we talk a lot about structural change, and some practical things we're doing is really through our DEI efforts in the organization, we're really trying to understand what role do we play in that as individuals, as an organization, and how do we help make meaningful change, working with our partners and collaborators throughout the country that are vested in making these kinds of changes as well. It's only when we can start preparing people and getting them more prepared for college and career or workforce and get them into careers that would be of interest and meaningful, that we will meet those goals of equity and inclusion.
I was hoping that I could add a little to that. There have been a number of very incisive comments made about how there is not equal opportunity with respect to certain kinds of assessment. And I think that by bringing in multiple measures, one can help try to address equity concerns. For example, someone might not have come from a school system that provided a fair level of support, and therefore that may be that may be, reflected down the road in terms of an assessment, but that individual does bring other very valuable and even more important skills to the admissions decision. And by allowing individuals to shine in multiple ways to show those skills that may in fact sometimes compensate for lack of opportunities, I think that it does provide multiple measures an opportunity for equity to be achieved, at least better than before. I think that each of these measures can assess an important set of skills that are important for success, and the lack of opportunity for people to be able to shine, the lack of opportunity to be able to demonstrate their strengths, I think is inequity. And so I think it is really key for us to have multiple measures available in an admissions process. And people should be included in higher education, and the opportunities that multiple measures bring, I think helps facilitate that.
All right, thank you for that, David. Anyone else from the panel would like to chime in? Okay, so I'm going to move to the next question then, which I think gets at, again, another question posed in the chat. So it's the third one. How do you balance the need for a valid test score from every test taker with the need for comparability across a diverse body of test takers?
I could start drawing from a little bit of the experience with the MCAT exam. I think there's two things. I think one is just the broad, free and low cost test preparation resources helps along, from the beginning to the end, from getting ready for the exam through actually taking the exam. So really, almost being like where appropriate, a surrogate advisor for those that don't have that kind of resource. Additionally, I think it's important, as we do in the MCAT exam, to make sure the context is relevant. We test a lot in the living systems, which is what you would encounter in medical school. And so we don't have contexts that folks would necessarily be so unfamiliar with. And I think both of those things help answer the question there.
I can follow up on that, Kyndra. The principles of measurement and psychometrics are built on group level properties of tests. And even the notions of validity are also organized around group level indicators. And obviously they're not adequate or appropriate for evaluating validity of scores for individuals. So though we have recently started focusing on individual level response processes and getting at the more details of engagement with tests. So when we talk about aligning assessments with learners or individuals' life and learning experiences, this may require assessments to deviate from the typical standardization where everyone takes the same test or at least equated tests or equated tasks. So I refer to this notion of conditional inference or conditional fairness notion that very eloquently discussed by Bob Mislevy in his 2018 book, Sociocognitive Context of Assessment. This notion prioritizes equivalence of evidence over equivalence of responses or equivalence of tasks, so that allows us a framework to work with to really think about possibility of aligning tasks, aligning assessments to individual background and interests and identities and opportunities to learn, and allow us to make sense of those performance on those tasks in ways that might make comparable interpretations. So that's a challenge for our field right now. I think it's really important for us to look into what it means for individuals from different cultural or educational experiences taking these different forms, and whether prioritizing, as you put it, validity at the individual level, how that can be achieved, and what kinds of compromises we'll need to make using our typical notions of comparability.
Great, thank you. I have another question. Has anyone done any follow-up studies on those who were denied admissions to college, graduate school, or medical school? And how did the denial impact those people's career and life choices? Follow-up study. I can. So
No.
I assume it's a no. Yes.
So that's an answer.
All right.
No, we haven't done the study.
All right. So
I was talking. I was talking on mute, but yes, I'm pretty sure that no one is, or we haven't done that work. And as I was thinking about the question, I'm not sure how we would track that in terms of obtaining the data. I'd have to think a little bit about how we would track those students. Right now, we're able to track students through their college career and completion, because the colleges send the data to the National Student Clearinghouse. But those are typically only students that are enrolled, and then we can track to see if they their completion rates. I'd have to think about that.
all right. Another question is, how satisfied are you with the toolkit of psychometric models and methods to visualize the problems related with DEI in your specific cases? Is it a problem of not having the optimal tools, or that we don't use the tools to their fullest potential?
Well, in terms of psychometric tools, I guess we can talk about mean score differences. We can talk about differential item functioning. I don't know that we have a lot of research that really understands or looks at things from a different perspective on DIF. For example, I'm aware of some work that we're doing where we're actually trying to take a little different angle of it and look for sort of hidden factors amongst groups of items that have been flagged, to try to understand if there's any patterns there. And typically we write items so that they are so devoid of context that very few items will flag at any one time. So I think we are missing some psychometric tools to better understand what we're seeing, or ways of interpreting what we're seeing and putting that in context. We spent a lot of time saying, I did my DIF studies, I found one sea level.
Kyndra, I will follow up on Diane's response. Oh, I definitely think we need new tools, and there are. With digital assessments, we have different data sources inform the kind of interpretations we can make on individuals' engagement with assessments. Again, DIF is based on our notions of very broad grouping categories and overall score comparisons, conditional on some overall performance, using a lot of assumptions around on the rest of the assessment. There are we're beginning to explore some newer tools that allow us to look at meaningful engagement of individuals and in assessments, and to what extent their engagement can lead to appropriate interpretation of their performance through, again, response processes and how they engage with the assessment, their actions on the assessments that help us understand how they're engaging with assessment that goes beyond their final responses, beyond their total score.
All right, thank you.
And sorry, I think that extends, so thank you for that. And I've been thinking about how this extends beyond that to really thinking about how to better predict applicants' likelihood of success, and how to identify those students who may have come with different educational opportunities, but the combination of experiences they have and other things about their application signal that they have the capacities to succeed thinking about medical school. And so some of our schools are working, and we're working with them on different ways of predicting likelihood of success, which is more positive than talking about risk, as a way, but doing so with big data to try and understand what are the things, if we're not using scores to weed out, right? If medical schools are looking for applicants who will become students, who will become physicians who want to serve their community, how is it that we leverage all of the data that we have about them, their college experiences, their high school experiences, the communities they come from, along with their scores to understand their capacity to succeed? And that feels like a little bit like way out there, but I think about that in addition to the things we're talking about here as being part of what we should be investigating, because I think in the short term, we have the reality that inequity exists, and it exists and it reflects itself in the standardized test scores of academic skills. Sooner or later, it's going to probably be reflective in the assessments of non-academic skills as they become things that people know they have to practice for. And so to me, there has to be also attention to what we have now and how to use it better. Because if you think about the fact that aptitude is distributed among every racial and ethnic and group with like experience, but the opportunities are not. How to think about how to take that into account in things like admissions decisions, to me is at the forefront of our work.
All right, thank you, Cindy. I have another question. What, if anything, about our existing admissions tests need to change? Is it sufficient to continue to use them as is, adding such things as non-cognitive measures, more effective preparation, and more support after admission?
So I absolutely believe that we have to have a richer set of assessment tools, which do cover a broader range of determinants of success. So that, I think, clearly would include a lot of soft skills measures, measures of non-cognitive skills. So I definitely think that's an area for future focus.
I would agree with you, David. I think and what we're finding is the addition of the social emotional skills as a component can help us understand more about students that would be successful, regardless of what their academic profile looks like.
I also think another interesting issue is how do we measure success? And I think that's also a very underexplored area in higher education. We tend to have traditional notions of what that means, and I think that there may be some innovations that maybe we could discover researching that question.
All right, thank you. I have a question for you, David, I think, well, based on something that you mentioned. You mentioned, I think, conducting DIF to examine learning gaps. So there's curiosity about how groups would be formed to examine this, or what techniques would be used to examine this topic.
I think I mentioned that.
My apologies.
And our work is very, very early on. So we're using our traditional DIF, ABC measures to identify, to look at patterns, to see if there's targeted outreach that we can make. I mean, early results suggest that there's opportunity in reading graphs and basic mathematical functions, or basic mathematical operations. So we're very early on, but it just was a rich amount of data for us to kind of start exploring, so that we can kind of see if there are opportunities. So very early on in our study.
Thank you. We'll be looking forward to the outcome.
So Kyndra, there's a chat, and it's about unintended consequences. And I just wanted to say, because this might not be exactly what they're meaning about unintended consequences, but when we think about the work that's being done in medical schools to really drive admissions committees to look at applicants with a wider range of scores and consider accepting more applicants with mid-range scores, because our data show that those that are admitted have high success rates and are more likely to come from diverse backgrounds. But there's this equal burden if you're admitting students, some of whom may need support, right? That you have the resources available. And when we don't talk about that part of this process, then there will be unintended consequences if medical schools or any schools really admit students without thinking about the full kinds of support that would meet students where they are, with the flexible kinds of resources, sometimes academic, but a lot of times non-academic. It's not academics at all that might be needed to help ensure that they have inclusive success. And so I feel like that is, another hard part of this is thinking about how the work we're doing in admissions can't be divorced from what happens once students get into medical school. Medical school is hard. Schools describe it as drinking from a fire hose in the first 2 years. So students have to be ready, and that readiness can come with lots of different kinds of support, but not if we're only treating the entry point.
All right, thank you for that. So we are almost at time. So to respect everyone's time, are there any final comments that anyone has?
Great discussion. Thank you.
You're welcome. And
excellent program. I'm glad I attended.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. So remember that there will be another session next week, same time, not the same link, but you will be receiving it. So 3:30 next Thursday. And then there will be one following that, the final one, the following week as well. So we look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you.